Now, the Chery Omoda 5 has proven to be incredibly popular in our market, breaking even the most optimistic sales predictions. However, for the first time in the mass market segment, Chery is now offering a choice of powertrains between the 1.5-litre turbocharged 4-cylinder and this, which is all-electric. Say hello to the Omoda E5, which at 146,000 ringgit is the most affordable way to crack over 400 kilometers in a crossover body style. My name is AIMAN ABDULLAH, this is Malaysian Motoring, and this is our review of the Chery Omoda E5. And the brakes work, by the way. Now, obviously, the biggest difference between the Omoda 5 and the Omoda E5 is the powertrain. So gone is the turbocharged 4-cylinder up front, instead replaced with a single electric motor producing about 150 kilowatts and 340 Newton meters of torque. Now, this is good enough to propel this car from 0 to 100 in about 7.6 seconds, and it's all powered by a 61 kilowatt hour LFP BYD blade battery. Now, this is notably a little bit cheaper than the BYD Atto 3 because its direct competitor, in order to offer 430 kilometers, you actually have to step up into the premium, which is about 160-ish thousand ringgit, whereas this is only 146. But despite that, there is something that I'd like to point out, and that is in terms of packaging. Now, before we get into all the salient stuff, I'd like to point out a key difference between the BYD Atto 3 and the Omoda E5, which is perhaps emblematic of how the automotive industry is going to progress going forward. The Omoda E5 is built off of an existing chassis that was designed in order to incorporate both the internal combustion engine as well as this all-electric powertrain, whereas the BYD Atto 3 was designed from the outset to use an all-electric chassis, and therefore there is some packaging benefits, which we will touch on in a moment. Now, onto the more salient stuff. From the moment you walk up to the Omoda E5, you can tell this is a slightly different vehicle from the Omoda 5 that we've kind of gotten used to by now. Because even though the broad architecture, the sort of bigger picture stuff looks very similar, the details are very different. So for starters, this face now no longer has that expanding Cosmos grille from the Omoda 5. Instead, it's all cleaned up and nice and neat because obviously this being an electric car, it doesn't really need that much cooling. On top of that, you will find that the daytime running lights have actually been reprofiled. The Omoda 5 had this sort of T-junction shape type thing along with scrolling indicators, whereas this is a more neat arrow type affair. And on top of that, you don't get scrolling indicators on this thing. However, down here, you still get the same lower lighting units, which means you get full LED headlights replete with LED high beam and LED fog lights, which double up as cornering lights, and so these still function pretty well. The other thing that's worth noting up front is that you now have this lower grille in order to help cool the battery. This is an active cooling system with active shutters, which means it can close when the batteries don't need to be cooled, therefore improving aerodynamics. Now, the eagle-eyed amongst you may have also noticed that up here, you no longer find a Chery badge. This is because in China, Omoda is actually its own separate sub-brand, and so the Omoda E5 arrives in Malaysia only with Omoda branding, which is why you get Omoda printed nice and bold up here, which I think actually looks quite nice. Now, behind that Omoda badge, you will find the charging ports. Now, this is a little bit sort of hit and miss for me because I quite like reverse parking my cars because I think it's a little bit safer. But having the charge port on the nose like this means that when I do drive up to a charger, I have to go nose in. That said, however, it does make it a lot easier for some of those charging stations with shorter cables or heavier cables. You don't have to travel very far, but I digress. Now, up front is again where you find those chargers, where you have a CCS2 port for both AC and DC charging. Now, in terms of AC charging, the Omoda 5 can charge up to 9.9 kilowatts off of a 3-phase charger, which means that the 61 kilowatt hour battery can be topped up in about 6 and a bit hours from flat, although obviously whoever comes back with a flat battery. But more importantly, in terms of fast charging, the Omoda 5 can accept up to 80 kilowatts, which means 30 to 80% charge can be completed in about half an hour. Now, Of course, this is very similar to what we've seen from the BYD Atto 3, which also charges at about 80 kilowatts. However, it's the AC charging that makes the biggest difference, because in BYD models, at least up until the seal, charging is up to only about 7 kilowatts. And of course, if you have a charger that doesn't quite work with it, then you end up getting about 3.7 kilowatts instead of the full 7, which means at 9.9, you're effectively getting a lot more charge, particularly when you're plugged in like at home or at the office, which I think is quite good. Now, the downside of having the charge port up here is the fact that when this port is open, you can't open the bonnet. Now, you have to be very aware of this because the car doesn't stop you from opening this before opening the bonnet and vice versa. And so if you're not careful, you might end up damaging this. Now, I mentioned that because the Omoda E5 actually offers a decent amount of under front or under bonnet storage. Decent for an EV at least. This is not a particularly large space, but it is big enough to hold your Type 2 to 3-pin charger, which I think is quite practical because, again, of the proximity to the charge port. It's just that, again, you have to open the bonnet, remove that first, close the bonnet, and then open the charge port. And this process is a little bit tedious because you can't open the charge port from the key. Both the bonnet and the charge port needs to be opened from inside the cabin on the right side of the driver's seat, which again is a little bit irritating. And on top of that, the key for the Omoda E5 is so laughably large that they could have had at least a button in there to open the charge port, which I think is a little bit of a missed opportunity. Now, the side of the Omoda E5 sort of suffers from the same issues that the Omoda 5 did, for better or worse, and primarily that has to do with the wheels. So even though the Omoda E5 runs on 18-inch alloy wheels wrapped in Kumho Extra tires, it just looks a little bit under-wheeled. This is a very typically Chinese car problem. I suspect it's because tires are cheaper when they're smaller, or that's the reason why they're designed this way. And these aerodynamic wheel designs don't really help the case much either. And on top of that, it does also feel like the overhangs on this car are quite significant, and as a result, it just sort of makes it look a little bit worse than it is. That said, aside from that, the rest of the Omoda E5 is still pretty good looking. If you ignore the fact that the battery pack is actually quite visible from where you are, it does still look pretty handsome. And for a B-segment crossover, I do find the Omoda E5 seems to have better road presence than a lot of other crossovers out there. In fact, in a car park, you might be mistaken to think the Omoda E5 is actually a class larger simply because of that design. Now, the Omoda E5 notably does come in some pretty interesting colors, including like this mint green, which I think looks very fetching. This gray, on the other hand, is a little bit more somber, but unlike the Omoda 5 Turbo, where you can get it as a two-tone, all Omoda E5s come in a single-tone design. At least you still have the floating roof effect though. Now, the back of the Omoda E5 also has a bunch of blink and you'll miss it changes. All of those changes, of course, are in order to reduce drag and improve aerodynamics. So while you still have the rather exuberant upper spoiler here, you now gain this little ducktail lower spoiler in order to reduce drag, improve aerodynamics, and therefore range. It's the same case with the bumper because it's also gotten rid of the visible exhaust exits that we got from the Omoda 5 Turbo. Instead, you just now have this nice, cleaner sort of look. Now, like in the front, you still don't get a Chery badge at the back. Instead, you just have Omoda in this very distinctive script, which I think looks a little bit nicer than the Chery badging, but that is just me. And obviously you have E5 here, and that is the only way that you can tell that this is the electric model over the internal combustion one. Aside from that, everything here remains the same. So you still have this very sculpted rear end with this very dramatic roof line. You also have these full LED taillights replete with scrolling indicators, but they seem to have lost the welcome animation function that we got from the Omoda 5 Turbo. Instead, they just sort of switch on and off, which is fine, I guess, because again, if you reverse park your car, you're never going to see that anyway. Now, behind the standard fit electric tailgate, you will find a pretty good amount of space. Now, it is worth noting that this boot is not quite as large as what you get on the BYD Atto 3, but we're really splitting hairs. Simply because, again, it goes back to that packaging thing I mentioned earlier. Because the Omoda E5 is not built off of a bespoke electric platform, some compromises had to be made. So again, this boot is not as large as the BYD Atto 3, but this is, I think, perfectly large enough for 5 adults worth of luggage for, say, a weekend trip away. And of course, if you need more space, there is actually room underneath the boot floor. It's a little bit shallow, but this is actually deep enough in order to hide your charging cables. That said, the Omoda E5 does not come with a spare tyre. Instead, you just get a tyre repair kit, but that's okay because they do offer roadside assistance. Now, inside the Omoda E5, you will figure out very quickly that this interior is very different from the Omoda 5 Turbo, because the overall architecture in here is actually very similar to what we saw from the Tiggo 8 Pro as well as the Tiggo 7 Pro. This is as a result of the Omoda E5's positioning as a more premium product over the Omoda 5 Turbo. Now, that aside, the only real complaint I have in here is the fact there are no storage bins for me to put my sunglasses. I would have preferred a slot up here. But aside from that, everything in here is much better than you'd expect at this price point. Now, BYD admittedly set the bar quite high within this segment by offering a cabin in the Atto 3 that was very soft and very well put together, full of soft touch materials. But the Omoda E5 does exactly the same thing, because up here it's all nice and soft, and up here it's all nice and soft as well, replete with this bright yellow stitching that goes up against this contrasting blue faux leatherwork, which I think not only looks convincing but also feels pretty nice as well. Even up front you get this lovely sort of beige material, again with that yellow stitching all the way around, lots of soft touch material all the way around here, and it does look and feel really good. Now, it is worth bearing in mind that the Omoda E5 can be had with two interior color options, that being black or this, which is this sort of blue and white colorway, which I think makes the interior feel and look a lot more premium. Now, on that premium stuff, you also get a very different steering wheel from what we got from the Omoda 5 Turbo. So now you no longer get sort of physical buttons, individual buttons. Instead, there's all sort of touch capacitive with a button behind it, very similar to, for lack of a better comparison, what you get from Land Rover. Now, what I will point out, however, is that the buttons in here, or the spaces for the buttons, are significantly larger than what you get in most other cars that use systems like this, like Volkswagen, for example. And so I have found that misoperation has been greatly reduced, although I would still prefer actual physical buttons. On top of that, because it's a different steering wheel, you also get a different steering wheel boss, which in this car says Omoda instead of Chery. And I do appreciate the fact there's like this nice rose gold bit down here in the center spoke, which I think again makes the car look upmarket, and it matches with the little bit of rose gold trim that goes around this center console. Now, aside from that, the metalwork in this car is all standard chrome, so don't worry, you're not going to find more of that rose gold stuff in case it's not really for you. And everything does look quite nice to the touch, although of course on closer inspection you will find that the majority of the harder stuff in here is all just plastic. Now, there is also a full wood trim in here on the door cards, on the dash front, and even here on the center console, and I feel like it's here where it's most offensive, simply because it's a very large swathe of the stuff and it's very close to your eye line, which means, you know, you'll end up seeing how fake it is. But once you get over that, and of course you can wrap it if you want, everything in here is just really nice. The overall architecture is really good, the ergonomics are pretty decent as well, and all of your buttons fall very easily to hand, and they are broadly where you'd expect those controls to be. My only gripe in here is the fact that the shortcut panel that used to live ahead of the air conditioning vents for your air conditioning controls, among other things, has been removed. Instead, all of those functions are now in this central infotainment screen. I bring this up because this car offers wireless Apple CarPlay and Android Auto, but in order to manipulate anything with the air conditioning, it requires a swipe from the bottom in order to manipulate it, which means that while that menu is up, there goes your navigation. However, when you swipe down from the top, you will find your shortcut menu where you can actually customize this to some extent to have all of your most used shortcuts in a very easy to access location. So I guess that does minimize interaction with it a little bit. But that said, the screen is a little bit further away, which means when I'm driving, I do actually need to lean forward to manipulate this screen. Now, that aside, ahead of me sits another digital screen, this obviously working as the instrument cluster, very similar to what we saw from the Omoda 5 Turbo. Of course, the interface in this car has been reworked slightly because obviously an electric vehicle has very different information to present versus something with internal combustion engine. So instead of having a tachometer, you now just have your speed and power gauge thing readout on the left side, with the right side dedicated to trip information and so on and so forth, with the center of the screen itself dedicated to ADAS functionality. Like the Tiggo 8 Pro as well as the Omoda 5 Turbo, and what we also expect from the Tiggo 7 Pro, Chery's ADAS system does a very good job of explaining to the driver what it sees. So therefore, as a driver, it allows you to better predict what the car can and cannot react to. And so it gives you a better degree of confidence when you're relying on the system, for example, when you're in traffic jams or when you're out on the open road. Although the ADAS system in this particular car has actually been upgraded, because for the Omoda E5, as part of its level 2.5 ADAS suite, we now get a camera system up here in order to monitor the driver's attention, very similar to what we've seen before from the smart #1. But we'll get onto the way that works a little bit later. Now, in terms of the controls, as you can see, obviously here we no longer have a gear selector because the gear selector is now up here. There's also no start-stop button because in this car you just get in and hit the brakes and the car switches on. And to switch it off, you simply get out of the car. Now, the gear selector is something I'd like to point out because on the gear selector itself, obviously you have a P button, which if you press and hold when the car is moving, it activates something called a pocket brake function, which is when the car will use all of its braking forces in an emergency situation in order to bring the car to a halt. Now, I've only used this twice for testing purposes, and obviously I haven't need to use it practically, but it's an interesting feature, although I'm not sure whether or not anyone will really use it, but I digress. In terms of practicality, you have a couple of cup holders here, a wireless charger up here, which if I recall correctly does up to 50 watts of charging, which means if you have a compatible phone, you can actually just leave it there and you will be able to regain a significant amount of charge. And there's even a set of vents in order to cool your phone while it's charging. Now, underneath the center console, you will find an air-conditioned central storage bin, which can keep drinks cool, for example. And where the gear selector used to be, you will find another cubby here, which you can close, or in my case, I put my cards in here as well as my sunglasses when I need it. There's a shortcut row of buttons here for your major HVAC controls like turning on and off the air conditioning, the defogger and so on, as well as your drive mode selector. Now this car comes with Eco, Normal and Sports, but again we'll get onto that a little bit later. You do have a couple of electric front seats up here replete with ventilation, although there isn't memory functionality or lumbar support, but at least these seats are decently comfortable. And of course this steering wheel is also reach and rake adjustable. You get a central dimming rear view mirror, and of course you get this little sunroof, which I haven't really been using that much because it's been very hot. Now the back of the Omoda E5 is a little bit of a hit and miss because initially everything does seem quite positive, but it's only when you start living with it will you start to notice some of the little idiosyncrasies. So for example, as you can see, I have a good amount of knee room and a good amount of headroom despite the standard fit sunroof, and overall the seat bench, for example, is also a little bit longer too. These rear seats are nice and sculpted, which means when you're sat back here as an adult, you actually get a decent amount of side support, and I do think that doing a long journey in this shouldn't be too bad. However, again, some of you may have noticed that I don't have much in terms of under thigh support, and that again brings up the fact that because this was adapted from an internal combustion platform, the floor on this car is a little bit higher than you might expect, very similar to what we saw from, for example, the Mercedes-Benz EQA and EQB, where the floor has to be raised in order to make room for the batteries, which compromises somewhat in terms of rear comfort. However, the front seats have been mounted relatively high, which means you can tuck your feet in underneath the seat in front of you, and with a little bit of man spreading, you can get some under thigh support, which means I wouldn't really mind doing a long distance journey back here. Material quality is also still just as good as the front, with lots of soft touch material even all the way down here and up here. You get a USB-C and USB-A port there, you get seat pockets back here, you get decently sized door bins big enough for a bottle, and of course you get a deployable center armrest with a couple more cup holders. But again, like I mentioned, those idiosyncrasies are still here. So for example, that floor means you have to man spread, and so if you have 3 abreast back here, middle row comfort or middle seat comfort is somewhat compromised, although at least the floor is flat. And then there is the fact that there is a rear aircon vent, one, which means that if you have 2 passengers back here, you're gonna have to fight over who gets that vent. Now, the way I've tried to solve this problem is to simply point it upwards, so it creates a sort of little bit of cool space here, and then at least that way no one has to argue. But of course, if you don't have passengers that are old enough to argue, you will at least find the ISOFIX mounts here, which are hidden behind these tethers, and so therefore it's quite easy for you to mount a rear-facing or even a front-facing child seat. However, rear-facing child seats may collide with the front seats because they do curve back quite a bit, although I have found that with the driver's seat set in my driving position, I'm about 170-ish centimeters, there shouldn't be too much of an issue here. And although the window line is quite high and there is no sunblind, at least the car does come tinted as standard, which means children back here should be pretty much okay. The other thing that I'd like to point out before I go is the fact that despite everything within this car, the rear windows in this are actually single pane glass. This is a departure from the Omoda 5 Turbo, which when we tested it had acoustic glass all the way around, which is a bit strange because electric cars are quiet. So wouldn't you want to emphasize that quietness? Or is it actually not that quiet? Now, to talk about the way the Omoda E5 drives is actually a bit of a complicated affair because quite a few changes have actually taken place in converting this car from the turbocharged model to this electric version. So as I mentioned earlier, the 61 kilowatt hour LFP battery underneath the floor, which powers a front motor which produces about 150 kilowatts and 340 newton meters of torque. That has all been covered. The thing is, in order to better manage the weight of that battery and the weight of the car overall, Chery has seen it fit to update the suspension in the Omoda from the torsion beam rear suspension that we got from the Turbo to a multi-link rear suspension setup for the E5. Now, multi-link rear suspension setups are generally better for many different reasons, but more importantly, they are slightly more sophisticated in terms of how they manage primary and secondary ride. And so in this, the first thing that sticks out to me is that change in terms of driving dynamics. Now, we first touch on comfort because it's obviously going to be the first thing that you'd experience in this. And where the Omoda 5, we argued, was a little bit floaty and was clearly geared towards comfort, the Omoda E5 has a far more sophisticated ride. It's quite clear that Chery's R&D engineering people, whatever, their suspension people, did a lot more work in order to ensure that this E5 feels like a more premium, more upmarket affair. In fact, I'd argue that the Omoda E5 actually rides better than what you get from the Tiggo 8 Pro, which is again a little bit on the floaty side, whereas this feels far more dialed in than you might expect, particularly from a car bearing a Chinese name. And so, because of that, despite the extra weight, the Omoda 5 has a degree of agility that you wouldn't necessarily expect. So even though this ride is now, I guess you could say, a little bit firmer than it used to be, it is never really uncomfortable. But the big benefit obviously is in terms of the way this car drives. Because while the interior remains very comfortable and very composed, in terms of the agility and handling of this, the E5 is a very different machine than the Omoda 5 Turbo. So for starters, when you're on the power or when you're on the brakes, the car does not pitch and dive as much as it used to, which obviously has huge benefits for cabin comfort. But then when you take it through the corners, you realize that this car now has a degree of control and confidence that the Omoda 5 Turbo simply did not have. And as a result, it means that whether you're driving this car in town, you're trying to maneuver through traffic jams, for example, or tight spaces, for example, or when you're out on the motorway or even on a back road taking slightly faster corners with a little bit more enthusiasm and exuberance, the Omoda E5 really does keep up. And on top of that, because of the use of these Kumho tires, or Kumho, I'm sorry, I probably am getting the pronunciation for that wrong, but because of those tires, it also does a pretty good job at keeping everything in check, both the weight and the dynamics of the car. And admittedly, this car does not wheel spin nearly as easily as the Turbo. So these are all very positive things. And then, of course, when you're on the motorway, you'll appreciate the fact the Omoda E5 remains very comfortable and very refined. This is something that, again, we complimented the Omoda 5 Turbo about because it was very quiet and very refined, particularly compared to, say, the Proton X50 and so on. But for the E5, compared to the BYD Atto 3, this just feels like a more upmarket, more considered machine. As a result, it never feels that this cabin ever gets uncomfortable, even when you're driving particularly fast, which I think is very impressive for what is ultimately a B-segment crossover. Even at speeds north of the national speed limit, you will find that wind and road noise is relatively well suppressed, although I will argue that the lack of engine noise altogether, obviously being electric, does mean that your ears will pick up a little bit more noise than you might necessarily expect, but overall, this does remain very quiet. And again, when you're out on the motorway, you appreciate the fact that this interior is as comfortable as it is, that these seats are as supportive as they are, albeit without any sort of lumbar support. And it just feels like a very well put together place. And of course, when you are out driving, that's when you really appreciate this car's active safety features. So as I mentioned earlier, the Omoda E5 comes with Chery's level 2.5 ADAS systems. So that means you get things like radar guided cruise control with traffic jam assist, blind spot monitoring, rear cross traffic alert with AEB. You get a 360-degree camera, you get lane departure warning with emergency lane departure prevention assist. You also get intelligent collision mitigation, where apparently the car can figure out if there is a potential hazard in your way and steer the car based on what it thinks is safest. All of these things work together with that driver attention warning camera to ensure that even when you're using these systems to their fullest extent, your eyes are still on the road and your hands are still on the wheel. Because, as I said, this car is very comprehensively equipped, which means it doesn't matter if you're driving this car in town or if you're driving it out on the open road. It doesn't matter if you're driving this as, say, a small family, or if you're just a singleton like me and you just need something that is decently compact but still spacious enough to use day to day. The Omoda E5 pushes forward Chery's continued push and commitment to value, because if you ask me, for 146,000 ringgit, this is a really well-equipped machine. The electric propulsion aside, it wasn't that long ago that that kind of money wouldn't get you anything with specifications like this, let alone things with a floating center console with extra storage, the ventilated seats, let alone the active safety. So you put all of that together, and once again, the Omoda E5 puts an incredibly good value proposition forward. Of course, I do know that many of you will be saying, why would I buy the electric E5 when the Omoda 5 is significantly cheaper? And that is true. The Omoda 5 comes in at a shy whisker under 120,000 ringgit, whereas this is 146. That's not exactly a small gap. But the reason why you might want this over the turbo is simply based on use case, because ultimately when you're talking about electric vehicles like this, efficiency is key. No matter which internal combustion method you go for, be it hybrid or plug-in hybrid, diesel, petrol, turbo, non-turbo, whatever, they all share the same characteristics, which is they are inherently more wasteful when you're stuck in traffic, because when you're sat there, there is still going to be an engine idling, and as it's idling and you're not doing any kilometers, that's when the car will end up using a lot more fuel. It is, as I said, wasteful. Whereas in the Omoda E5, and indeed every other electric car, when you're driving in town and driving through traffic, that's when they are most efficient and you get the best possible energy consumption readings. So I'll give you an example. Driving this car over an empty road going from, say, KL to Putrajaya with barely any traffic, this car will return about 16.5 kilowatt hours per 100 kilometers. This is a pretty regular figure that we'd be able to replicate several times over the week or so we've had this car. However, bear in mind the 430 kilometer claimed range is based on a 15.3 or 15.5 kilowatt hour per 100 kilometer consumption figure. When this car is driven through traffic, because obviously over Raya there was spots of traffic, especially even in town, when you're doing sort of bumper to bumper crawls, that's when this car consumes a lot less. In fact, I've been seeing figures as low as 14 kilowatt hours per 100 kilometers, which means that this car would quite easily exceed the 430 kilometer range that it claims to. But of course, like with internal combustion car, fuel consumption, or in this case, energy consumption figures are based entirely off of how you drive. And so the more efficiently you drive, the less the car will consume, and vice versa. But if you ask me, the reason why you'd want this over the turbo is simply for your use case. If you're the kind of person where you spend 90% of your time in town and only really take on a long distance trip every once in a while, this is the car for you. And on top of that, the Omoda E5 also looks after you when you travel over longer distances, because this is the first car in Malaysia to offer plug and charge capability. Together with their partners Jom Charge, which also works with Jom Charge's roaming partners like Gentari and so on, this vehicle is able to simply plug and charge. You don't need to authorize via an app and so on. You simply plug the car in and the car will start charging, and then you will be billed afterwards once you're done, provided that you have accurate billing information or potentially credits in your Jom Charge app. That means that this Omoda E5 in terms of functionality is on par with a Tesla, which is about 40,000 ringgit more expensive than this. So I would wager that this is, again, the best value proposition on the market. BYD doesn't offer simplicity like that, neither does anyone else, let alone brands like Aura under GWM, which means that this is a very simple way to drive. The only thing is, at 146,000 bucks, obviously you do have some options. If you don't need a B segment crossover, then you may be better served by the BYD Dolphin, which is about 20,000 ringgit more affordable than this, offers comparable range and decent performance, while giving you a decent amount of practicality as well. I personally love the BYD Dolphin. I love the way it looks and the way it drives, and you can check out my swooning over that car in our review of the BYD Dolphin. So if you're just looking for an electric city car, that might be better for you. And of course, if you are the sort of person that really fills up the boot on a regular basis, let's say if you have strollers or if your kids have bikes and stuff like that, then maybe the added practicality of the BYD Atto 3 might be a bit more appealing. And of course, if you're odd, there is also the Aura Good Cat. But to me, in terms of comprehensive packaging, I believe that the Omoda E5 really hits the nail on the head because it offers fantastic usability in town, a decent amount of performance when you're on the motorway. It's got a really comprehensive suite of features, both in terms of safety and convenience, and it's got that plug and charge capability. So if you ask me, if I had 150 grand and I needed a B segment crossover, this is most likely going to be it for me. Despite the fact that I preach the benefits of diesel, and of course I love turbocharged turbocharged petrols, especially when I'm driving enthusiastically, in terms of practical usability, you don't really get very close to an EV. They're comfortable, they're quiet, they're refined, and for the most part they are efficient in terms of both usage and cost to run on a day-to-day basis. I've really enjoyed my time with the Omoda E5, and if anything, it just makes me want to go and irritate Chery to try and put this suspension setup on the Omoda 5 Turbo, because that would make that car absolutely fantastic once they've recalibrated the feel of the brake pedal, of course, which in this car feels just fine. And so that concludes our review of the 2024 Chery Omoda E5. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, hit the little bell icon so notified every time we make a new upload. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And you can join our new WhatsApp channel. All the links are in the description below. Thank you so much for watching. We will catch you in the next one. Take care, stay safe, and jangan bodoh.